The sun was dropping low over the desert horizon, its molten glow turning the ridges and valleys into jagged silhouettes of red and black. Heat shimmered above the sand, but already the air was cooling in the shadowed ravines where soldiers crouched, scanning the vast emptiness for movement. A unit of reconnaissance troopers had dug in for what they thought would be another routine night, quiet, tense, but uneventful. At the edge of their formation, half hidden behind a crumbled wall of stone, knelt a woman whose presence most of them hardly noticed anymore. She was tall, lean, her olive-green fatigues marked by dust and sweat, her long blonde hair tied back in a strict ponytail under her helmet. From a distance she looked like any soldier caught mid-action, braced against her weapon with a kind of stillness that could be mistaken for a dramatic pose. A couple of the younger men had joked about it before, nudging each other when she settled into position as if she was about to be photographed. They didn't know her, not really. To them, she was just another face rotated into their squad, a quiet replacement from some elite unit who barely spoke during downtime and disappeared the moment the patrol ended. Her rifle was longer than anything they'd seen issued to standard troops, a monstrous, custom-made thing that looked more like a cannon laid out across the rocks than a firearm. No one believed she would ever actually use it for more than show. But she wasn't posing. She was studying, waiting, her mind calculating distances the way others breathed. Through her scope, the world stretched far beyond what the men around her imagined possible. She wasn't looking for shadows in the next valley or movement at the ridge a mile away. Her eye was pressed against glass that magnified shapes so distant they blurred with the horizon. She followed the faint heat signature of vehicles, their outlines crawling along a dusty road 15 miles away. Most people would never have seen them with bare eyes, but she tracked the rhythm of their engines, counted the glints of metal, traced the staggered way their convoy spread across the terrain. She could tell from their pace that they were not locals. Too steady, too precise, too well armed. Her breath was slow. To her right, Sergeant Keller muttered something about rations, not even noticing how she shifted her grip on the rifle. Behind her, two soldiers whispered a crude joke about the way she crouched with her back arched, one elbow planted for balance as if she were rehearsing for a combat magazine cover. They thought she was just striking a pose, wasting her time aiming into nothingness. The truth would not fit their comprehension. 15 miles. No sniper in recorded history had made such a shot in real combat. Training simulations spoke of it as an impossible standard, something to push calculations against but never to attempt. Even the most legendary sharpshooters had maxed out at less. To hit a target at that distance wasn't just about skill, it demanded control over physics, wind currents, humidity, even the invisible shifts of air pressure between valleys. It demanded nerves of steel. And it demanded absolute belief that what you saw through the scope was more than a mirage. Her finger brushed the trigger guard, not yet pressing. She took a slow inhale, her chest rising beneath the weight of her vest, then exhaled until her lungs felt hollow. Through the glass, a single figure stood beside one of the vehicles, his movements sharp, authoritative. Even across the distortion of heat, she could read command in his stance. He gestured to the convoy, adjusting positions, barking orders to men who snapped into compliance. She knew without a doubt, this was the target. The commander who had orchestrated weeks of ambushes, whose strategies had cost her side dozens of lives, whose intelligence networks had evaded every attempt to root them out. Taking him out would cripple their operations, save entire villages from being raided. And yet, from this distance, the attempt bordered on madness. A single gust of wind could throw the bullet yards off. A single misjudged calculation could make her nothing more than a fool with a long rifle and broken pride. Still she steadied. Her mind ticked through variables. Temperature drops since sunset, angle of elevation, barrel heat, drag coefficient of the round, the microsecond shift she'd need to compensate for Earth's rotation itself. Her lips moved in silence as if she were praying, but it wasn't prayer. It was numbers, equations, a ritual of precision burned into her bones. Then, still as stone, she squeezed. The recoil jolted through her shoulder, whisper quiet compared to the thunder most rifles made, but enough for every man nearby to pause mid-sentence. None of them followed the bullet's arc. None of them believed it could matter. To them, the shot vanished into the infinite horizon, a wasted effort, a theatrical pose to match the long weapon she carried. Seconds passed. Too many seconds. A normal shot would have landed long ago. One soldier snickered under his breath, nudging his buddy as if to confirm what he'd always suspected. She was all show, no result. But then, faint and distant, a plume of dust erupted beside the convoy 15 miles away. Through her scope, she saw chaos. Men scattering, the commander collapsing into the dirt, the convoy halting in disarray. Her breath left her in a slow, invisible smile. Around her, silence spread. Conversations cut off mid-word. Jokes froze on lips. Every head turned to stare at her, disbelief painted across their faces. They had thought she was just striking a pose. But that single shot, spanning 15 miles of desert and possibility, had carved the beginning of a legend. The silence after the shot was almost heavier than the desert air. For a few seconds, no one dared breathe, as though even the wind itself was stunned. The younger soldiers blinked at her, their smirks wiped clean, their eyes wide with the shock of men who had just witnessed something their training had told them was impossible. Sergeant Keller finally exhaled a sharp curse, his voice breaking the spell. "No way. That's no way." His disbelief was shared by everyone crouched in the rocks, each one frozen between awe and fear, trying to reconcile the image of a quiet, almost statuesque woman with the devastation she had just delivered across a distance most couldn't even picture clearly in their minds. Through her scope, she didn't watch their faces. She only watched the convoy. Dust spiraled upward, headlights flicked on, shadows shifted in panic. She saw soldiers scrambling to drag their fallen commander back into the vehicle, but the man wasn't moving. The bullet had done its work with surgical precision, cutting through armor, flesh, and the thin fabric of command that had once bound those men together. Now the convoy looked more like a disorganized mob, some trying to flee, others shouting, none with the clarity of leadership. She tracked them for another 30 seconds, long enough to confirm the kill, then pulled back from the rifle and finally turned her eyes toward the squad around her. The weight of their stares pressed down on her, but she didn't flinch. She simply began breaking down her rifle, every movement methodical, calm, almost indifferent. To her, the shot was just the outcome of calculations and practice, the natural conclusion of a long process of preparation. To them it was a miracle. "Who the hell are you?" one of the privates finally blurted, his voice cracking. No one laughed at him for asking. They all wanted the same answer. She didn't respond. Instead, she slid the massive rifle back into its case, locked the clamps and secured the straps as though nothing remarkable had happened at all. Keller crouched closer, his weathered face lined with suspicion. "That wasn't luck," he muttered, low enough that only she could hear. "Nobody pulls off 15 miles on luck. I've seen sharpshooters, the best in the force. None of them could even think about that shot." He leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "You've done this before, haven't you?" She gave him no more than a glance, her expression unreadable, her silence heavier than words. He wanted an answer, but she wasn't the type to hand it over. Whatever her past was, it wasn't written in the files they had been given when she arrived. The higher-ups had kept it quiet, and now Keller understood why. The squad broke camp quickly after that, nerves sharpened by the knowledge that enemy forces would scatter and regroup. But everywhere they moved that night, whispers followed her like shadows. The younger men who had laughed about her posture no longer dared make eye contact. The private who had asked who she was kept his distance, as if she were something untouchable, dangerous. Even Keller, grizzled and hard from decades of service, found himself looking at her with a new edge of respect. Legends were usually born in stories told after missions, exaggerated tales passed down from soldier to soldier. But this was different. They had seen it themselves. And the desert didn't let a man unsee what he had witnessed there. As they moved, she stayed in her usual silence, scanning the horizon, adjusting her pack without complaint, slipping into position whenever the unit paused to recon. But inside her the shot lingered. Not the glory, not the recognition, but the weight of it. She had known when she squeezed the trigger that if she succeeded, it would change everything. Her anonymity would die. The peace she found in being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed as posing, it would vanish. She could already feel it unraveling around her. By morning the whispers would turn to rumors. By the end of the week the rumors would be stories. And by the time they rotated back to base she would be something she had never wanted to be, a legend in uniform. For now, though, the desert gave her space. They crossed jagged ridges under a rising moon, the sand glowing silver, their boots crunching softly as they trekked toward safer ground. She kept her eyes forward, her hands steady, every sense alert. War had no patience for myths or admiration. Somewhere out there, beyond the ridges and shadows, other commanders would hear what had happened to the convoy. They would not dismiss it as impossible. They would adapt. They would hunt for her, the ghost sniper who could end a man's life from 15 miles away. And in their fear they would become more dangerous. She knew this because she had studied them, hunted them, and seen how men turned when fear infected their strategies. When they finally reached their fallback point, a ruined watchtower overlooking the barren flats, Keller pulled her aside. "I don't care what your file says or doesn't say," he told her in a low, harsh voice. "You're not like the rest of us. That shot, that was history. But history comes with a price. They'll never stop looking for you now. Hell, even our own brass will want to use you like a weapon they can brag about. You know that, don't you?" She met his gaze, her eyes calm, steady, unflinching. She said nothing. But in that silence, Keller saw the truth. She already knew. She had known before she pulled the trigger. And she had pulled it anyway. As the others bedded down, their nerves too frayed for easy sleep, she sat apart, her rifle case propped beside her, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The desert wind whispered through the broken stones, carrying sand across the floor of the tower like grains in an hourglass. She felt time slipping, faster now, rushing toward something inevitable. Tonight she was still just a soldier among them. But tomorrow and the days after she would become something larger, something she could never fully control. Legends had power. But legends also had chains. And she wondered, as she finally leaned back against the cold stone wall, whether she had just forged her OWNWY. The time dawn painted the desert in muted strokes of gray and gold. The shot had already begun its journey far beyond the crumbled watchtower. Radio chatter across the region picked up frantic bursts of encrypted transmissions. A commander dead, a convoy shattered, an unknown marksman whose reach defied reason. Reports traveled faster than the wind, carried not just by soldiers but by fear. The enemy, who had once moved with ruthless confidence, began whispering in their own camps about a ghost who could kill from distances they couldn't comprehend. The 15-mile shot was exaggerated even further in the telling, some saying 20 miles, others claiming she had fired blind through a sandstorm. The numbers mattered less than the effect. Terror wormed into their discipline, doubt corroded their orders. Leaders hesitated, troops second-guessed, convoys slowed. In a war where momentum was survival, hesitation was poison. Back at the watchtower, her squad awoke to the crackle of new orders on their comms. Higher command wanted confirmation, details, proof. No one asked Keller for it. No one asked any of the others. All eyes turned to her. She sat apart from them, already geared, rifle case strapped to her pack, her comm as steady as it had been before the shot. She didn't confirm or deny anything. She simply looked at Keller, who eventually gave the radio operator a single nod. "Confirmed?" he said, his voice flat. That one word rippled like stone tossed into still water. Within hours, a transport arrived to extract her, a dark green bird cutting through the morning sky with a sound that made every man's stomach sink. They had all known it was coming. Someone who could do what she had done would never be left in the field, not to chance, not to obscurity. The brass would want her under their direct eye, paraded in front of them like some secret weapon they had personally forged. Keller shook her hand before she boarded, his grip firm, his eyes searching hers for some flicker of what she might feel about being pulled into the light. But her gaze was distant, unreadable, fixed somewhere past him, past the desert, on horizons none of them could see. The flight back was quiet, save for the drone of engines and the occasional crackle of the pilot's voice over comms. She sat in the rear, helmet off, eyes closed, her hands resting lightly over her knees. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to remember the training that had led her here. The countless nights lying prone in cold mud, calibrating her breathing until her pulse slowed enough to vanish into silence. The endless charts and data sheets, the calculations scrawled in notebooks until they blurred together. The failures, so many failures, before the first impossible shot finally landed true. She had not been born with this skill, she had built it, piece by brutal piece, grinding herself down into precision until her mind and body became extensions of the rifle. It had cost her friends, relationships, fragments of her humanity. Now the world was ready to lift her up for it, to paint her as a hero. She wondered if they would still cheer when they learned how much she had sacrificed to earn it. At base, the reception was everything she had feared. Officers lined the landing pad, their salutes crisp, their faces lit with something between pride and hunger. Cameras were there too. Cameras for a war that had long ago been declared too grim for publicity. She stepped down from the transport into the glare of spotlights, her boots touching concrete with the weight of inevitability. Applause broke out, too loud, too eager. She didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't even acknowledge it. To them she was no longer a soldier. She was a story. And stories were tools. In the following days, the machinery of legend-making ground into motion. She was questioned, debriefed, recorded. Every detail of the shot was dissected. Wind speed, humidity, angle, distance, ammunition. Analysts tried to replicate it in simulations and failed, their frustration feeding the myth. The number 15 miles became a refrain, a headline, a chant whispered through barracks and blasted across networks. Soldiers in the mess hall glanced up when she entered, whispers trailing behind her. "That's her," they muttered. "The ghost sniper. The 15-mile legend." She ate in silence, never looking up, as if the food on her tray mattered more than the eyes burning into her back. But outside the walls of the base, the consequences were sharper. Enemy forces tightened their operations, sending out decoys, moving under heavier armor, scattering their convoys into smaller, harder-to-target groups. In villages and towns caught between fronts, her name became a hushed prayer. Mothers held children closer, speaking of the unseen protector who could strike down killers from beyond sight. To the oppressed she was hope. To the hunted she was nightmare. And to her she was neither. She was only a soldier, carrying the same weight she always had, only heavier now because the world insisted on lifting it for her. Late at night, when the base had quieted and the floodlights dimmed, she would retreat to the range. Alone, with only the steel targets and the echo of her shots for company, she reminded herself who she was beneath the myth. Each trigger pull was a return to discipline, each impact a grounding against the swirl of legend. She feared what would happen if she forgot, if she allowed the stories to define her instead of her training. Because she knew stories had a way of consuming the people inside them, leaving only shadows behind. And yet, no matter how she resisted, the legend spread. She could feel it tightening around her like chains, like armor she hadn't asked to wear. Each morning, more soldiers saluted her, more officers sought her advice, more reports credited her with victories she hadn't even been part of. She became both shield and weapon, both symbol and soldier. And though she carried herself with the same quiet grace, the same stillness mistaken for posing, inside she felt the edges blur between herself and the legend they were carving in her name. The enemy didn't wait long to respond. Within days of the commander's death, intelligence reports painted a picture of an opponent shifting from offense to obsession. Entire units were pulled from patrols to scour the terrain where the 15-mile shot had been fired. Recon drones buzzed the skies, searching for traces of a position long abandoned. Messages intercepted from their comms revealed the tone had changed. Their leaders no longer mocked the coalition forces. Instead, they spoke of a ghost who had cut down a man from beyond sight, a phantom they needed to eliminate before fear tore their ranks apart. For every mile they moved, for every order barked, soldiers looked nervously toward the horizon, imagining her rifle pointed at their hearts. Inside the coalition base, the brass welcomed this shift with smug satisfaction. "She's worth 3 divisions," one general remarked during a strategy meeting she was forced to attend. He said it like she wasn't there, like she was just another asset listed on a balance sheet. They can't maneuver without looking over their shoulders. Morale's collapsing. Supply runs are crawling. We're winning this war without firing another shot, thanks to her. The officers around him nodded, their smiles sharp and predatory. They didn't see her as a person. They saw her as leverage, as the embodiment of psychological warfare. She sat in silence at the edge of the table, hands folded neatly, her expression unreadable. But inside she felt the old unease stirring. Legends she knew were double-edged. The more fear she inspired, the more desperately the enemy would hunt her. And sooner or later that hunt would reach her squad. Her prediction came true on their next deployment. She had barely rejoined Keller's unit when they were ordered to move into contested territory, an operation that made little sense on paper. The objective was vague, the terrain brutal, the risk high. Keller's instincts prickled. "They're baiting us," he whispered to her one night as they crouched over maps by the glow of a red lens flashlight. "They know you're here. They want you. And they don't give a damn if the rest of us burn so long as you're dangling on the line." She said nothing, but she felt the truth of it in her bones. She wasn't being deployed as a soldier. She was being used as a lure, a myth meant to draw fire. The trap snapped 2 days later. The squad was moving through a canyon when the first mortar struck, the blast echoing so violently the stone walls seemed to scream. Shards of rock rained down, dust choking the air. Enemy fire erupted from both ridges, a deadly crossfire designed not to kill them quickly but to flush her out, to force the ghost into visibility. Keller barked orders, the squad scattering for cover, rifles spitting back into the cliffs above. Amid the chaos, she lay prone against the canyon floor, her massive rifle cradled in her arms. She scanned the ridges, heart steady, eyes sharp. They weren't trying to kill the squad. Not yet. They were trying to pin them, to make her take the shot that would reveal her position. For long minutes she refused. She let the bullets crack and snap around her, let the enemy waste their ammunition in fury. But then she saw the glint, one scope reflecting faint sunlight from the far ridge. A sniper waiting for her to rise, his barrel trained like a predator on the faintest movement. She exhaled, slid into place and fired. The round tore across the canyon, cutting the glint into silence. But the moment she pulled the trigger, the enemy guns pivoted. They had her. Mortars shifted, machine guns poured fire where she lay. The canyon floor exploded around her, stone shattering, dust rising in choking plumes. Her squad reacted instantly. Keller threw smoke grenades, the thick clouds swallowing the canyon in a choking haze. "Move! Move!" he roared, dragging her by the arm despite her protest. They sprinted through the haze, stumbling over jagged rock, bullets snapping blindly into the fog behind them. 4 hours they ran, climbing ridges, diving into ravines, chased by the relentless thunder of pursuit. By the time they broke free into open desert, the squad was battered, exhausted, 2 men wounded. But alive. Alive only because they had refused to let the ghost sniper die in her own legend. That night, as they collapsed in the shelter of a dried riverbed, Keller confronted her. His voice was hoarse, his eyes burning with fury. "You see it now, don't you? You're not a soldier anymore. You're bait. They'll throw us into the fire again and again until one side finally kills you. And all of us will go with you when it happens." His words cut, but they were true. Around them, the squad lay silent, too drained to speak, too haunted to sleep. The looks they gave her were no longer just awe. There was fear there now too, not of her but of what following her meant. She sat apart, rifle across her knees, staring into the darkness. In the distance, the desert stretched endlessly, silent and indifferent. She thought of the 15-mile shot, of the pride and disbelief that had followed. And she wondered if, in that moment of impossible precision, she had signed a death warrant, not just for herself but for everyone forced to walk in the shadow of her legend. Back at base, she could feel the shift the moment her boots touched the tarmac. The squad was hustled off to medical, patched up and debriefed, but her path split from theirs immediately. She was escorted to a sterile chamber lined with officers and intelligence analysts, their eyes hungry, their pens scratching at every detail she gave them. They wanted numbers, wind speed, trajectory, confirmation that the canyon ambush had happened exactly as reports suggested. She gave them clipped answers, her tone flat, her eyes never leaving the center of the table. She could tell by the way they leaned forward, by the gleam in their eyes, that they weren't listening to her words. They were listening to the legend that draped itself over everything she said. To them, the canyon wasn't a near massacre. It was a victory. Proof of her value. Proof that she could bait entire battalions into throwing themselves into traps. Proof that her very existence could bend the war. That night, while the officers drank to her success in their private mess, she slipped quietly into the barracks to check on her squad. Keller was sitting at the edge of a cot, his arm wrapped in a sling, eyes burning with the kind of exhaustion that didn't fade with sleep. The others were scattered, silent, avoiding her gaze. They weren't ungrateful, they knew she had saved them as much as endangered them, but the distance between them was growing. She could feel it in the way they stiffened when she entered, the way conversations died mid-word. To them she was no longer just a comrade. She was the reason every mission became a death sentence. Legends weren't companions. Legends were storms that swept men along, whether they wanted to be swept or not. She sat on the bunk opposite Keller, resting her rifle across her lap. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "They're going to use you until there's nothing left," he said quietly. "You know that, don't you?" She nodded once, slowly. He leaned forward, his voice rough. "You need to make a choice. Either you stay their weapon and let them throw us into hell until we don't come back, or you find a way to end it before it swallows all of us." His words lingered in the stale air long after he lay back on his cot. She didn't answer him. She didn't know if she could. The following weeks blurred into missions, each one more dangerous than the last. They were dropped into contested zones where intel was thin, ambushes frequent, survival uncertain. Always the enemy seemed to know she was there. Always they came harder, hungrier, their desperation fueled by the fear she had sown. And each time she delivered. Shots across valleys, through crosswinds, over ridges. Shots that felled leaders, silenced artillery crews, tore holes in supply lines. Her squad bled for those victories, men wounded, men buried, their numbers shrinking under the weight of her legend. But command only saw the results. They didn't count the bodies left behind. They counted the kills, the victories, the headlines. At night, when the desert grew still and only the stars watched, she lay awake, staring at the endless sky. She thought about the families of the men she killed, about the faces that flickered through her scope before she pulled the trigger. She thought about the soldiers beside her, breaking under the pressure of being tethered to someone who had become more symbol than human. And she thought about herself, about the silence that stretched inside her chest, the hollowness left behind each time she made the impossible possible. She had once believed precision was purity, that mastery of the rifle meant control. Now she realized it was chains. Every shot she fired only bound her tighter to the legend they were building around her. One evening, after a mission that left 2 men dead and another maimed, she sat alone cleaning her rifle. The metal gleamed under the lamplight, the long barrel reflecting her face back at her in warped distortion. She caught herself whispering aloud, a question she hadn't dared form until now. What am I becoming? Her voice sounded foreign, brittle. She thought of the villagers who spoke of her as a savior, of the enemy soldiers who cursed her name in fear, of the brass who toasted her as a living weapon. None of them saw her. None of them cared about the woman behind the rifle. All they saw was the shot. The 15-mile legend. Keller approached quietly, leaning on the doorway, watching her with that same steady gaze that had seen too many wars, too many graves. "You're still you," he said softly, answering a question she hadn't asked aloud. She looked up, meeting his eyes, searching for belief in his words. He shrugged. "But if you keep letting them write your story for you, one day you won't be." Then he left, his footsteps fading into the darkness, leaving her alone with the gleam of her rifle and the weight of his warning. That night she didn't sleep. She sat awake until dawn, staring at her weapon, the tool that had made her a legend, the curse that chained her to a future she didn't choose. For the first time since the shot, she felt fear, not of the enemy, not of death, but of the possibility that Keller was right. That somewhere along the line she would cease to be herself, and become only the myth. And if that happened, she wondered grimly, what would be left of the woman who once was mistaken for just striking a pose? The war changed shape around her. Where once it had been fought over terrain and resources, now it revolved around a single figure, the unseen riflewoman who could end a man's life from miles away. Every briefing she attended was framed through the lens of her legend. They're pulling back because of you. They've delayed this offensive because of you. They won't risk convoys through that valley anymore, not since the shot. The generals spoke her name as if it were a weapon system, as though they could load her into artillery and fire her across the map. On the other side, the enemy began broadcasting propaganda, crude posters and radio intercepts that painted her as a demon in human skin, a monster who could kill from the edge of the world. They offered bounties so high they dwarfed entire yearly salaries, promising riches and honor to the soldier who brought her down. And as her fame grew, so did the noose. Her squad felt it more than anyone. Patrols became gauntlets, ambushes tighter, traps more cunning. No longer were they fighting for tactical advantage. The enemy came for her specifically. They planted decoys, staged false convoys, and used civilians as shields, hoping to bait her into revealing herself. The squad paid for every attempt with blood. One man lost his leg to a hidden mine, another never made it out of an ambush. Each time, Keller patched the survivors back together with grit and stubbornness, but the cracks were widening. They no longer spoke of her with awe. They spoke of her with resignation, like men who knew they were chained to a storm they couldn't outrun. The brass didn't see it that way. To them, every failed enemy trap was another victory, proof that her legend was stronger than their fear. They started staging missions specifically to showcase her ability, pushing her into increasingly impossible scenarios just to prove the myth was real. Journalists were embedded in forward positions, their cameras catching only fleeting glimpses of her silhouette, her rifle gleaming under desert light. She avoided the interviews, avoided the attention, but she couldn't avoid the stories written in her name. Each article exaggerated more than the last. 20-mile shots, 30-mile kills, miraculous rescues no human could have achieved. She didn't read them, but she couldn't escape the whispers. In the mess hall, in the barracks, in the field, everyone knew the ghost sniper. Few knew the woman. One mission finally revealed how far the enemy would go to break her. They were ordered to escort a humanitarian convoy through a narrow valley, a mission that seemed routine compared to the ones she'd been given before. The squad moved cautiously, wary of the cliffs on either side, but nothing stirred. 4 hours they trudged, the trucks grinding forward, dust rising in lazy trails. It wasn't until dusk that Keller's instinct screamed. He froze mid-step, scanning the ridge. "This is wrong," he muttered. The silence was too deep, the stillness too perfect. And then she saw it. Movement just barely visible, the faintest reflection of glass. Not one sniper. Dozens. Rifles lined the ridge like teeth, all angled down at the valley floor. The convoy wasn't the target. She was. The ambush sprang like a steel trap. Bullets rained down in a storm, shattering stone, ripping through canvas, sending the convoy into chaos. Soldiers dove for cover, screaming orders lost in the thunder. She dropped instantly, pressing into the dirt, her rifle already swinging up. Through the scope, she caught one, then another. 2 enemy snipers cut down before they could even fire their second shot. But for every one she silenced, 5 more waited. The air filled with the shriek of ricochets, the dirt erupting around her like miniature volcanoes. Keller dragged her behind the axle of a smoking truck, his face streaked with blood. "They're here for you," he shouted over the roar. "You can't stay here." But she shook her head, her hands steady on the rifle. "If I run, they win." His jaw tightened, torn between fury and fear, but he didn't argue. Instead, he gave her what she needed: cover fire, orders barked to the others, buying her seconds where there should have been none. For the next hour, the valley was hell. She crawled between shattered rocks, her scope finding targets one by one, her trigger pulling in perfect rhythm with her breath. Each shot was a duel, each kill a gamble. She could feel them tightening the net, trying to corner her, to force her into a shot she couldn't make. Her body ached, her lungs burned from the dust, but her mind stayed cold, calculating. She thought back to the 15-mile shot, the stillness of that moment, the disbelief that followed. This wasn't stillness. This was chaos. But the same discipline held. She let the math guide her. She let the rifle speak. By the time the firing eased, the valley was littered with silence. Smoke drifted over broken trucks, wounded men groaned in the dust, and the ridges were empty save for the bodies of those who had tried to claim the bounty. She lowered her rifle, her arms trembling, her breath ragged. Around her, the squad staggered out of cover, battered but alive. They looked at her with that same mix of awe and dread, as though she had summoned death itself to walk beside them. Keller leaned on his rifle, his voice raw. "They'll never stop," he said. "Not until one side finally breaks." She met his gaze, and for the first time she didn't have an answer. Because deep down she knew he was right. And the longer she survived, the tighter the legend's grip grew, not just on the enemy, not just on her squad, but on her soul. That night, as they limped back toward base under a blood-red sky, she walked at the rear of the column, her rifle heavy on her shoulder. The desert stretched endless before her, but she felt it closing in, narrowing with every step. She was no longer the soldier mistaken for striking a pose. She was the legend the world demanded. And legends, she realized bitterly, were never meant to last. The ambush in the valley had changed everything. By the time her squad limped back to base, the story had already spread. She had held off an entire regiment of snipers alone, saving the convoy with impossible precision. The official reports didn't mention the men who bled out in the dirt, the broken trucks still smoldering in the dusk. They didn't mention Keller dragging the wounded to cover while she fired, or the look in his eyes when he realized she was becoming a magnet for every bullet in the war. The reports only told one story: the ghost sniper had cheated death again. And the world devoured it. Headquarters responded with fanfare. A general shook her hand in front of cameras, pinning another medal to her chest she hadn't asked for. Her face, still smeared with desert grit, became the centerpiece of broadcasts, her silhouette carved onto recruitment posters. "She never misses," the slogan read. Young recruits arrived at the front whispering her name like a prayer, like a promise that if she fought for them they couldn't lose. She hated it. But the higher her legend climbed, the harder it became to step down. If she faltered, the entire illusion threatened to collapse, and with it, the fragile morale holding the line together. Keller saw it eating her alive. "They've turned you into a ghost," he muttered one night as they sat outside the barracks, the desert wind cold against their skin. "And ghosts don't get to walk away." She didn't answer. She wanted to tell him she was still flesh and bone, that she still woke gasping from dreams where she saw the faces of men she had killed, that she still felt the bruises of recoil against her shoulder. But the truth was worse. The longer she carried the rifle, the less she felt like herself. Each shot stripped away another piece until only the legend remained. The breaking point came weeks later. Intelligence reported a final push from the enemy, a massive armored column moving toward a captured city. High Command wanted her at the center of it, the ghost herself perched in the ruins, holding back the tide until reinforcements arrived. "You'll be the spearhead," the general said, his tone reverent. "You'll be the story that wins the war." She looked at Keller, hoping for protest, for someone to say this was madness. But he only gave her a hollow stare. They both knew she didn't have a choice. The mission began before dawn. She climbed into the skeletal remains of a half-collapsed tower, her rifle heavy on her back. The city was dead around her, windows shattered, streets lined with wreckage, the air thick with the smell of rust and ash.